Up next, we have Frank Hammer, who is a labor activist and retired General Motors auto worker. He's the former president of UAW Local 909 and umpire staff for the UAW International Union. He's a lecturer in the Labor Studies program at Wayne State and Indiana universities, and a member of the board of directors of the Real News Network. Welcome, Frank.
Greetings. I can't tell you how significant this is for me, and I really appreciate the invitation to participate in this. I'm going to be talking a little bit about history, but I'm not a historian. I've been very active on the fronts of the UAW agreements with the Detroit Three, and I've also been very active here, especially with Jewish Voice for Peace here in Detroit in response to the genocidal attacks by Israel on Gaza and in the West Bank. So let me, the bio is a little dated. It doesn't matter. I do have an affinity with UC Berkeley because I attended Berkeley from 1961 to 1967. And I have an affinity with graduate teaching fellows because I was one at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor from 67 through 70. I settled in Detroit in 1974, 1 year after the Arabic UAW members staged a wildcat strike to protest the UAW's investment in Israeli war bonds or whatever they were called. I first worked at a Chevy Forge plant here in Detroit, and then later I worked at a second plant, Warren, what became a Warren transmission plant. In 2016, and I'll go back to that history, but in 2016, I connected with the UAW 2865 campaign for BDS when I learned that the International Union under the administration caucus, and I don't remember whether it was Dennis Williams who was the president at the time, in my take was illegally overthrew the resolution passed by 2865 on behalf of the BDS campaign. And I reported on that, or I was part of an interview with one of the persons that was in that campaign in a Real News piece in 2016. So I feel very connected to the efforts by UC grad students back then. I'm currently active with the United Auto Workers for Democracy, UAWD. And a year ago, I was one of the advocates of a pro-BDS resolution, which narrowly passed, and after a lot of debate. So that's very much front and center. And of course, we have a new UAW leadership, and it offers, some new opportunities, and we can talk about that. The history I'll describe, and I'm going to go through these notes that I've scrambled to put together, took place during my organizing at my second GM plant, which was when I was a member of Local 909. I was then, back in 1982, part of a no concessions movement. And most of the history that I'm going to be described took place during the New Directions movement in the UAW in the mid and late 1980s. I was part of that New Directions movement by 1986 here in Region 1, and most of it was in opposition to the administration caucus, and it was against then President Owen Beaver. So you'll find it pretty surprising that I'm going to be saying some very favorable things about Owen Beaver, especially in his role in the campaign against apartheid in South Africa. He was first elected president in 1983. I think that was my first convention. And I'm going to go through this little history now. In 1985, he was one of the first trade union leaders arrested for demonstrating against apartheid at the South African embassy in Washington, D.C. He was accompanied by Mark Stepp, who eventually became a VP over the crisis department. In January of '86, he won AFL-CIO approval of a boycott of U.S. companies doing business in South Africa under apartheid. Um, um, it was a coalition of labor and civil rights and women's groups launched this nationwide boycott of Shell oil products, a move aimed at turning up the pressure on the South African government to end apartheid. Later that year, he traveled to South Africa where he met with several cabinet ministers and angrily demanded that the government release anti-apartheid labor leaders who had been jailed but never charged with any crimes. There was a campaign initiated around that time, which I think highlights a great role that UAW played. It was a campaign for justice for Moses Mayakiso. Moses Mayakiso and his brother and 3 others were arrested in 1986, and I'll get back to that. He was a former auto worker. He became general secretary of the newly formed National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, NUMSA. He helped to pioneer the democratic shop floor-based trade unionism and helped to draft the constitution of the largest labor federation in South Africa, COSATU, and that was in 1985. He was arrested in June of 1986 and held in jail for 2 years, charged with sedition, treason, and subversion. In Bieber's view, the trial was aimed at weakening the anti-apartheid movement, which Bieber declared in November of 1987 when the trial opened. According in the words of Bieber, the removal of Moses Mayakiso was a naked attempt to weaken the South African black trade unions, which in recent years have emerged as the key force opposing the repressive white majority regime. The trial was held in August of 1988 in Johannesburg. Bieber convened a committee of dignitaries, American jurists, to monitor the trial and to focus international attention. They pulled out ads in South African newspapers, full-page ads, and the UAW urged members in support of Mayakiso and tougher sanctions against the apartheid regime. Mayakiso and 4 other activists gained their freedom in 1989, and Mayakiso traveled to the United States to speak to the UAW convention that year and thanked the UAW and the global labor movement for solidarity against the South African apartheid regime. In the meantime, there was this Shell boycott committee that Bieber is credited with starting. It was a coalition of over 125 U.S. organizations, which was pressuring Shell Oil to end its role as the key supplier of oil to the apartheid regime. The boycott was aimed at forcing it Shell to withdraw and thereby help to stop apartheid. The person behind the boycott, I'm reading from my notes, was Owen Bieber. And he had a wonderful sticker. And if I had time to put some things together, we could have viewed some of these for the boycott of the Shell Oil Company. In 1990, shortly after his release from prison, Nelson Mandela traveled to the United States and thanked Bieber for his support. And he also went to a local UAW 600, which was very instrumental in the anti-apartheid campaign. Bieber gave him a tour of the Ford River Rouge complex. In 1991, Bieber went to Johannesburg and condemned apartheid. On his first day of the 3-day visit to Johannesburg, he sharply criticized that nation's apartheid system, saying, "The word justice and South Africa will never go together until the practice is abolished." Bieber was invited to address the NUMSA Congress by NUMSA General Secretary Moses Mayakiso and the African National Congress. The Deputy President, Nelson Mandela, was also scheduled to speak. Bieber recalled the international campaign waged by the labor movement and led by the UAW to win Mayakiso's freedom from jail. Addressing the issue of continuing violence against union activists and apartheid leaders, particularly in the ANC, Bieber said, I find it curious that this same government, which is so intent on locking up union leaders, can't seem to bring to trial and convict the vigilantes and warlords who've killed 2,000 men, women, and children in the townships in the last year. Bieber went after the South African government for its role in the attacks on workers, ANC members, and supporters of the democratic movement. Bieber noted that 70% of South Africa's wealth was controlled by just 6 big companies, that 5% of the population owned 80% of the personal wealth, and that whites, who make up 14% of the population, earn 65% of the monthly wages. There was a publication the UAW used to put out called Ammo, and the whole 20 pages were dedicated to exposing apartheid in South Africa and mobilizing UAW members in support of the struggle. And they promoted 6 sanctions, which included a ban on further investments or loans to either public or private sectors of the South African economy, a withdrawal of landing rights of South African aircraft in the US, enforcing the 1977 UN arms embargo, and there's a few more others. I don't know how my time is going, so I think I want to wrap it up and let other speakers speak. But I did notice in one of the UAW or one of the publications that a declaration of May 1st as Anti-Apartheid Day, and I just want to connect that to recently with the conclusion of the UAW bargaining with the Detroit Three, that under the leadership of Sean Fain, it was determined that the contract should end in April 30th of 2028 in anticipation of May Day in that year. But maybe we can nudge the UAW to take up an Anti-Apartheid Day, not in 2028, but maybe next year. And with that, I'll conclude my report. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Frank. That was Frank Hammer, retired General Motors auto worker, former president of Local 909 and umpire staff at UAW International Union, and a veteran. We're happy to have you.